My narcissistic mother flirts with every boyfriend I ever bring home because she truly believes her own daughter could never deserve real love, happiness, or a man who actually stays. Grant's hands were shaking when he showed me the messages. We were standing in my kitchen in Rockford, Illinois, and the light over the stove was flickering the way it always did before it needed a new bulb. He held his phone out like it was something hot. "Your mom keeps texting me," he said. I looked at the screen. Diane Reyes, my mother, had sent him a photo of herself in a yoga pose, captioned with a laughing emoji and the words, "Maybe you should join me sometime, our secret." There were 6 more messages below it, coffee invitations, a comment about how tense I made everyone, a comment about how she understood men better than I ever would. I read all of it twice before I could speak. "This feels wrong," Grant said. He wasn't angry. He was scared, the way you get scared of something you can't name. "I'm sorry," I told him, because that was the only thing I could think to say. "I didn't ask my mother to do this." "I know," he said, "but it doesn't matter whose fault it is. It's happening." 3 days later, he broke up with me in the parking lot of the Culvers on State Street, both of us still in our work clothes, both of us refusing to look at each other directly. "I can't handle your mother," he said. "I need you to understand that's not about you." But it was about me. It was always about me, because she was my mother, and I was the only daughter she had, and somehow that meant every man who tried to love me had to survive her first. I sat in my car for 40 minutes after he drove away. I didn't cry right away. The crying came later, at home, on the floor of my bathroom with my back against the tub, my phone buzzing uselessly beside me because there was no one I actually wanted to call. I was 24 years old. I had been in exactly 4 relationships since I turned 18, and my mother had ended every single one of them. That night, staring at the ceiling of my apartment, I stopped asking why this kept happening to me. I already knew why. I started asking a different question instead. What was I going to do about it? My name is Sienna Reyes. I grew up in a 2-bedroom house on Delancey Avenue with my mother Diane, who was 44 the year Grant broke up with me, and who had been, by her own account, the most beautiful girl in her graduating class at Auburn High in 1998. She kept the yearbook in the living room, on the bottom shelf of the bookcase where guests would see it, opened to her senior photo, a habit I never once saw her break in 24 years. My father, Marcus, left when I was 7. I don't remember the fights that led up to it, only the quiet after, and the way my mother started saying his name like it was something she'd scraped off her shoe. He sent birthday cards until I was about 12, then stopped, and Diane told everyone who asked that he was a coward who couldn't handle a strong woman. Maybe that was true. I never got the chance to ask him myself. What I did get, in the years that followed, was a mother who treated every room she walked into as a stage, and every man in it as an audience, including the men her daughter brought home. It started small enough that I didn't have a name for it. When I was 16, I brought a boy named Cody Ferris to a family barbecue at my Aunt Denise's place in Belvedere. Diane wore a red sundress that wasn't hers, I later found out. She'd bought it that morning at the Cherryvale Mall specifically for the occasion, and spent the entire afternoon finding reasons to touch Cody's arm while she laughed at things that weren't funny. She asked him what he thought of her, twice, phrased 2 different ways, fishing so obviously that even my cousin Mateo noticed, and asked me later if my mom was always like that. I told him no. I told myself no too. I told myself it was just her personality, that she'd always been like that with everyone, not just Cody. And mostly I believed it because believing anything else felt disloyal. Cody and I broke up 2 months later. He said I was too quiet, too in my head, not enough fun. I didn't put it together until years afterward that fun, in his vocabulary, might have meant something closer to my mother's version of attention. By the time I was 19, the pattern had a shape I couldn't unsee. There was Tyler, who Diane invited to Sunday dinners without telling me first, who she sat next to instead of across from, who she once described to my grandmother as the kind of man who deserved a woman who really understood him. There was Preston, a year later, who she texted at 11 at night asking if he wanted to grab a drink sometime, just the 2 of us, laughing it off afterward as innocent when I confronted her, calling me paranoid, calling me ungrateful for a mother who only wanted her daughter's boyfriends to feel welcome. That was the word she used, welcome, every single time. It became a kind of code between us. When she wore the dress 2 sizes too small to meet someone I was dating, that was making him feel welcome. When she found reasons to be alone in a room with him, refilling his drink, showing him old photo albums, laughing too long at things he said, that was welcome too. I spent years being told that my discomfort was the actual problem, that a normal daughter would be grateful her mother took an interest, that I was the one making things strange by noticing. My grandmother Ruth tried to warn me once, the year I turned 21. We were in her kitchen in Machesney Park, and she was slicing peaches at the counter with her back half turned to me, the way she did when she wanted to say something she didn't want to watch land. "Your mother was like this before you were born," she said. "Even at your age, she never learned there's a difference between being loved and being wanted." I didn't understand what she meant then. I understood it perfectly by the time Grant left. The clearest early warning came the summer I was 22, with a boyfriend named Isaac, a physical therapist I'd been seeing for 8 months, the longest relationship of my life at that point. Diane invited him to a 4th of July gathering at Rock Cut State Park without asking me, called him personally, told him it would mean so much to her if he came even if I couldn't make it because of a work shift, which was a lie, because I had no shift that day. I found out only because Isaac mentioned it, confused, assuming I already knew. I showed up anyway. I watched my mother in a white sundress, years, standing closer to my boyfriend than she stood to anyone else at that park, laughing with her head tipped back, touching his forearm to make a point about nothing. Isaac noticed me watching. He looked embarrassed for both of us. That night he told me gently that something about the way my mother acted around him made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't fully explain. He didn't break up with me over it, not then. But 3 weeks later he did, citing distance, timing, nothing specific, and I always suspected the truth was simpler than any of the words he chose. By 24, I had learned to expect it the way you learn to expect rain in April. Grant was supposed to be different. He was a 6th grade science teacher, patient in a way that made me feel like maybe I'd found someone steady enough to survive her. He lasted 4 months, longer than most. And when he left, something in me finally cracked open instead of just bending. I didn't want another Grant. I didn't want to keep introducing good men to my mother like sacrifices and watching them retreat one by one, blaming themselves, blaming me, never quite landing on the truth, which was that Diane Reyes could not stand to watch her daughter be loved by someone who wasn't also, in some smaller and more twisted way, loving her. I didn't hate my mother. That would have been easier. I loved her the exhausted, obligated way you love someone who raised you even when they've hurt you. And that love was exactly what she'd been using against me for years. It kept me making excuses. It kept me showing up to Sunday dinners. It kept me introducing new boyfriends to her at all, when any reasonable person might have stopped by 22. What changed after Grant wasn't that I started hating her. It was that I stopped protecting her from herself. I thought about the problem for 2 weeks before I landed on the solution. I needed a man my mother couldn't seduce. Not because he was strong-willed or loyal or smart enough to see through her, all qualities I'd overestimated in boyfriends before, but because seduction itself wasn't possible. I needed someone gay. I thought of Julian Farrow almost immediately. We'd met at Northern Illinois University in a shared design elective back when I was 20 and majoring in communications, and he was already the most confident person I'd ever met. Julian had been with his boyfriend, Theo Alvarez, for 3 years by the time I called him that October. They'd met at a wedding in Madison and moved in together within 8 months, the kind of certainty about each other that made everyone around them a little jealous. Julian worked freelance doing graphic design for small breweries and boutique fitness studios around Rockford and Belvedere. He was sharp-tongued, unbothered by almost everything, and he had exactly the kind of dry, theatrical delivery that made him impossible to embarrass. I called him on a Tuesday night in late October and told him everything, starting with Grant and working backward through Cody and Tyler and Preston and Isaac, years of it pouring out of me faster than I expected. Julian was quiet until I finished. Then he laughed, hard enough that I heard him nearly drop something on his end. Finally, he said, "Some real drama. I've been doing brand refreshes for a kombucha company for 6 weeks. I need this. Count me in." The plan was simple on paper. I would tell my mother I was seeing someone new. I would bring Julian home as my boyfriend. Diane would do what she always did, throw herself at him, try to make him fall for her instead of me, and this time it would go nowhere, because there was nowhere for it to go. She'd exhaust herself on a dead end. Maybe, I told Julian, she'd finally learn something about herself in the process. Julian doubted that part. "I'll believe it when I see it," he said, "but I'll take free dinner and a show either way." I brought him to my mother's house on a Saturday in November. Diane answered the door in a black dress I'd never seen before. Her hair curled the way she used to wear it for church photos, her lipstick fresh enough that I knew she'd redone it in the last 10 minutes. She looked at Julian the way she used to look at the last piece of cake at a party. "You must be Julian," she said, holding his hand a full 3 seconds longer than a handshake required. "He's even better looking than you said," she added, to me, without looking away from him. Dinner ran 2.5 hours. My mother told her modeling stories again, the same 3 stories she told every man I ever brought home, about the department store catalog shoot in 2001, about the photographer who told her she could have gone to New York if she'd wanted it badly enough, about the pageant in Peoria she almost won. Julian leaned in for every word, nodding, asking follow-up questions with a straight face that nearly broke me twice. When we left, Diane hugged him at the door and held on a beat too long, told him he was welcome anytime, that word again, welcome, and swatted his arm playfully when he made some joke about her cooking. "She's already planning our affair," Julian said in the car, grinning. "That's disgusting," I told him. "That's my mother." I thought the joke would end there. I was wrong. Within a week, Diane was texting Julian directly. I know, because he forwarded me every message. Screenshots stacking up in our group chat with captions like, "She's really doing this and I need a raise for emotional labor." The first messages were harmless enough on their face, the kind of thing she could explain away as friendliness if anyone confronted her. A photo from her yoga class with the caption, "You'd probably enjoy this." Very grounding. A question about whether he liked Thai food, followed immediately by an invitation to a lunch spot downtown, just the two of them, to talk about Sienna's happiness, she said, like she was doing me a favor. Julian went along with it at first, playing the part, keeping his answers vague enough not to encourage her further, while still stringing the bit out for material. Within 2 weeks, she'd escalated to showing up at his apartment unannounced twice. Once with a container of homemade lasagna she claimed she'd made too much of, once with no excuse at all, just her, dressed for an occasion nobody had invited her to, staying for 2 hours while Theo sat in the next room texting me increasingly alarmed updates. "Your mother is currently telling Julian about her modeling days again," one message read. "She just touched his hair," said another. "I want you to know I am recording all of this for posterity." By the third week, the messages had a different tone. She started calling him instead of texting, sometimes twice in one evening, staying on the phone for 40 minutes about nothing in particular. Her failed marriage, her modeling career that never quite happened. How misunderstood she felt by everyone in her life, including me. Julian, to his credit, listened patiently, mostly because he wanted the material, but he told me afterward that some of it had genuinely unsettled him. She talks about you like you're a rival, he said, not like a daughter, like competition. I told myself this was still going according to plan. She was exhausting herself on someone who could never want her back, and every hour she spent chasing Julian was an hour she wasn't spending finding new ways to ruin something real. What I hadn't accounted for was how far she was willing to take it, or how much of herself she was willing to reveal in the process. 5 weeks in, Diane called me directly, something she rarely did anymore since I'd started pulling away after Grant. Her voice was thick, like she'd been crying, or wanted me to think she had. Sienna, I need to tell you something, she said. I think I'm falling for Julian. My stomach dropped into ice water. Mom, I said carefully, you've known him 5 weeks. Sometimes that's all it takes, she said. When it's real, you know quickly. I know this is difficult to hear, but I think we should all sit down like adults and talk about our feelings honestly. I hung up the phone and called Julian immediately, my hands not entirely steady. This is insane, I told him. She actually thinks this is real. Julian was quiet for a moment before he answered, and when he did, his voice had lost its usual performance. This is perfect, he said. Now we show her exactly what she's been doing to you for 6 years. I want to see her face when she finds out. I should have felt satisfied, vindicated even. My mother had finally done the thing I always suspected she would do if given enough rope, and now I had proof of exactly the kind of woman she was. Undeniable proof, the kind no one in my family could argue away as me being sensitive or paranoid or jealous of my own mother, which was an accusation I'd heard more than once over the years, usually from Diane herself, but underneath the vindication was something colder. A woman who could convince herself in 5 weeks that she was falling in love with her daughter's boyfriend wasn't a woman playing a careless game. She was a woman capable of believing almost anything if believing it served her, and I had just given her a stage large enough to prove it. The next escalation came 4 days later, and it was the one that finally told me how far my mother had drifted from reality. She showed up at Julian and Theo's apartment on a Tuesday evening with a bottle of wine and an outfit that looked more suited to a first date than a friendly visit. And when Theo answered the door instead of Julian, she seemed genuinely thrown, as if she'd forgotten Julian had a boyfriend at all, or had convinced herself it didn't matter. She asked for Julian by name, twice, growing visibly impatient when Theo explained he was still at work. Theo, calm as ever, invited her in anyway, mostly out of curiosity, and texted Julian a play-by-play while she sat on their couch, describing, unprompted, how she felt Julian understood parts of her that no one else ever had, how rare that kind of connection was, how she sometimes thought life had put them in each other's paths for a reason. Theo told me later he'd sat across from her the entire time thinking, calmly, that he was watching a woman describe an affair with his own boyfriend to his face, in his own living room, and that the strangest part wasn't her audacity. It was how sincerely she seemed to believe it. When Julian got home 20 minutes later and found his boyfriend and my mother sitting together over an unopened bottle of Cabernet, he had to leave the room to keep from laughing in her face. He told me afterward that Diane had looked disappointed to see him arrive with Theo standing right there, as if his boyfriend's presence was the inconvenience and hers was not. I confronted her about it the next day, calling instead of texting because some conversations deserve to be heard in a voice instead of read on a screen. Mom, you cannot keep showing up at his apartment, I told her. You're scaring him. He's in a relationship. Diane's response came fast, practiced, the same defense she'd used my entire life whenever anyone questioned her. You're always so quick to think the worst of me, Sienna. I was being a good future mother-in-law, getting to know him. That's what mothers do. I felt something in my chest go tight and cold at the phrase future mother-in-law, at how naturally it slid out of her, as if the fiction she'd built was already load-bearing in her mind. I want us all to sit down, she said again. That same line, and this time I gave her what she wanted, because Julian had been asking for it for a week. Fine, I told her. Saturday, my place. We'll talk. In the days leading up to it, Diane called 3 more times, each conversation stranger than the last. She told me she'd been thinking about how she and Julian could make things work without hurting me too badly, as though I were an obstacle to be managed rather than her own daughter. She told me she thought Theo was, in her words, a phase Julian hadn't fully worked through yet, a statement so detached from reality that I had to set the phone down and walk into another room before I responded. And in one call, almost as an aside, she said something that I didn't think much of at the time, but that I'd come to remember with a different weight later. I keep everything, Sienna, she said, apropos of nothing, in the middle of a rant about how unsupportive I'd always been. I always have receipts. People think I don't notice things, but I notice everything, and I keep it all. I let the comment pass. I had bigger things on my mind that week, namely the fact that my mother had convinced herself she was in a love triangle with a gay man who had a boyfriend she'd met in person on multiple occasions. I didn't think to ask her what receipts she meant, or what exactly she thought she'd need them for. That question would answer itself soon enough, in a way none of us saw coming. Saturday arrived colder than the forecast promised, the kind of gray November afternoon that made everything feel more serious than it might have on a sunnier day. My mother showed up at my apartment at 6, in a tight black dress and heels, a bottle of wine already open in her hand, as if she'd started celebrating something before she'd even walked through my door. Julian arrived 10 minutes later, dressed simply, calm in a way that made me realize how much he'd rehearsed this moment in his head. Diane hugged him at the door, held his forearm, told him he looked stunning, and I watched her do it, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel embarrassed. I felt something closer to pity, thin and cold, the kind you feel for someone standing at the edge of a cliff they don't know is there. We sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd once done homework as a kid while my mother got ready for dates with men who never lasted. I think we all know why we're here, Diane said, leaning toward Julian, angling her whole body away from me as though I were incidental to the conversation, a chaperone rather than the daughter whose life this entire evening had been about for 6 years. Diane, Julian said gently, you're an incredible woman. Her face lit up immediately, that particular glow she got whenever someone confirmed what she already believed about herself. But I need to tell you something, he continued, and I need you to really hear it. I'm completely in love with Sienna. Her smile didn't move at first. It just sort of froze there, waiting for the rest of the sentence to make sense. And I'm gay, Diane, Julian said. I have a boyfriend. His name is Theo. You've met him twice now, in his own apartment, which I have to say was a choice. Sienna and I have been pretending this whole time because you have chased away every single man she's ever loved, and she needed you to finally see it happening from the outside, instead of always being the one standing in the middle of it. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture, that you can feel pressing against your skin. My mother looked between us, and I watched something shift behind her eyes. Not embarrassment, not yet, but a kind of frantic recalculation, like she was searching for the version of this story where she still came out on top. This is a joke, she finally said, her voice thin. It's not, Julian said. You sent me photos from your yoga class. You asked me to lunch 3 separate times to discuss Sienna's happiness, which somehow always turned into you talking about your own. You told me, in your own words, that Sienna and I were probably just settling for each other because we hadn't found anything better. I watched the blood leave her face, then rush back in a wave of red climbing up her neck into her cheeks. She stood up so fast her chair scraped against my floor and her wine glass tipped, sending a dark stain spreading across the white rug my grandmother had given me as a housewarming gift 2 years earlier, the red bleeding outward like something that had been struck. I don't have to sit here and listen to this, she snapped, grabbing her purse off the back of the chair. No, you don't, Julian said, his voice still even, still calm, the calm of someone who had gotten exactly what he came for. But maybe you should, just this once. She turned on me instead, her eyes bright with something between fury and humiliation, the two emotions so tangled in her that I'm not sure she could have separated them herself. How could you humiliate me like this, she said, in front of him, in my own life. How could I humiliate you, I said, standing too, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. You've chased away every man I've ever loved, Mom. Every single one. I just finally showed you what it looks like from the outside. She didn't answer that. She grabbed her coat, called me an ungrateful, jealous daughter who'd always resented her own mother's beauty, and walked out so fast the door frame rattled the picture frames on my wall, one of them tilting hard enough that it stayed crooked for a week after, because I couldn't bring myself to fix it. I stood in my kitchen afterward, staring at the wine stain spreading into the rug's fibers, thinking it looked almost exactly like the shape of a wound, and finding that thought less dramatic than I expected. It felt, if anything, accurate. 3 weeks passed in complete silence. No calls, no texts, nothing, which for my mother was almost its own kind of statement, since Diane Reyes had never in my memory gone more than a week without needing an audience for something. I told myself the silence meant she was finally sitting with what she'd done, maybe even feeling something close to shame. I should have known better. My mother didn't process shame. She converted it into narrative, and she'd had 3 weeks to build one. My Aunt Denise called on a Thursday afternoon while I was still at work, her voice tight in a way I recognized from childhood, the tone she used whenever she was about to tell me something she didn't want to be the one telling me. Sienna, she said, your mother is telling a very different story to the entire family. My stomach dropped before she even finished the sentence. What kind of story? I asked, already knowing it wouldn't be a small one. According to Diane, Denise said, you paraded a gay man in front of her on purpose, to humiliate her in her own home, because she said men find her attractive and you've always resented that. She's telling coworkers. She's telling cousins. She told the prayer group at Second Baptist that her own daughter set her up to be publicly destroyed, that you and your friend planned the whole thing out of jealousy. I sat with that for a long moment, not because it surprised me, but because it was exactly the shape I should have predicted. This was the pattern my mother had run my entire life, on a smaller scale. Every single time something threatened the version of herself she needed people to believe in, rewrite it, become the victim, let everyone else sort the truth out from the wreckage, if they even bothered trying. There's more, Denise said, and her voice dropped lower, more careful. She says she has proof. Proof of what? I asked. Denise hesitated long enough that I heard her exhale before she answered. She says she has messages. Messages that make it look like you and Julian planned something worse than a prank, Sienna. Something that could get you in real trouble at work. I felt the floor of my understanding tilt slightly, the way it does right before you realize a situation is bigger than you thought. I worked as a marketing coordinator at a mid-sized firm downtown, Halbrook & Weiss, handling client accounts and social campaigns for a client roster that included 2 local hospital systems and a regional bank, the kind of work where reputation wasn't incidental. It was the entire their product. If Diane wanted to hurt me in a way that actually mattered professionally, this was exactly how she'd do it. I thanked Denise, hung up, and sat at my desk for a full minute doing nothing at all, just breathing, before my phone buzzed in my hand. One new message from an unknown number, a single photo attached, no caption. I opened it standing in the hallway outside the break room, and it took me a second to understand what I was looking at. It was a photo of the lobby of my own office building, taken from an angle that suggested whoever sent it had been sitting in the waiting area themselves. In the center of the frame, seated in one of the gray lobby chairs across from the reception desk, was my mother, in a navy blazer I didn't recognize, a folder resting in her lap, talking animatedly to my receptionist Priya, who I could see even in the photo had the particular polite, frozen expression of someone being told something they didn't know how to respond to. The message came through a second later, from the same unknown number, and it took me only a moment to recognize the writing style buried underneath the unfamiliar contact. "I'm here to speak with someone in HR about a serious matter concerning one of your employees," it read, an exact quote, the kind of phrase my mother would have rehearsed in the car before walking in. "I have documentation." My hands went cold before my brain caught up to what that meant. She hadn't just told a story to the family. She'd built a folder. She'd walked into my workplace, sat down in the lobby, and asked to speak to human resources about her own daughter, with printed documentation in her lap, ready to hand over whatever version of events she'd constructed out of 6 weeks of unhinged infatuation and 3 weeks of humiliated rage. And underneath the fear, underneath the sick lurch of realizing my job might genuinely be at risk over something I hadn't even done, a second thought surfaced, quieter, colder, and far more clarifying than the first. She kept everything. She always had receipts. She'd told me that herself, weeks earlier, and I hadn't understood until this exact moment what she'd actually meant. She hadn't been talking about grievances. She'd been talking about a plan. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. I didn't think. I moved. I told my supervisor, Renata, that I had a family emergency, grabbed my coat off the back of my chair, and walked the length of the hallway faster than I'd walked anywhere in months, my heels loud against the tile in a way that felt absurdly like a countdown. When I reached the lobby, my mother was still there, seated across from Priya's desk, her folder open now, papers fanned across her knees, mid-sentence about something I couldn't hear yet from that distance. Priya looked up first, and the relief on her face when she saw me was immediate and total. "Mom," I said, and my voice came out louder than I intended, sharp enough that 2 people near the elevator bank turned to look. Diane's head snapped up. For a half-second before she rearranged her face into something more composed, I saw pure satisfaction there, the look of someone whose trap had worked exactly as designed. "Sienna," she said, standing, smoothing her blazer with one hand. "I was just explaining the situation to this young lady." "What situation?" I said, walking toward her, aware of Priya watching, aware of 2 co-workers, Danielle from accounts and a man named Oscar from the design team, both slowing near the elevators to see what was happening. Diane held up her folder like evidence in a trial only she believed was happening. "I have screenshots, Sienna. Messages between you and Julian planning to deceive me. Photographs. I have proof that this was premeditated, that you used a stranger to publicly humiliate your own mother. And frankly, I think your employer deserves to know what kind of person they've hired. Someone capable of that kind of calculated cruelty toward her own family." I took the folder out of her hands before she could stop me, and she let me, maybe out of shock, maybe because some part of her still expected me to fold the way I always had. Inside were printed screenshots, real ones, texts between Julian and me from months earlier, discussing the plan in plain language, along with several photos Diane had clearly taken herself of her own text to Julian, presented completely out of context, captioned in her own handwriting with phrases like "proof of premeditated cruelty" and "evidence of targeted humiliation." There was no message in that folder that suggested I'd broken any law, harmed her physically, or done anything at work whatsoever. What there was, unmistakably, undeniably, on page after page in her own handwriting, was documentation of a grown woman's 6-week infatuation with her daughter's fake boyfriend, presented as though it were someone else's crime. "Ma'am," Priya said carefully, standing now, "we don't actually have an HR department on this floor. You'd need to contact corporate directly, and honestly, this looks like a personal family matter, not a workplace complaint." My mother's face flickered, the mask slipping for just a moment before she caught it. "This is a workplace matter," she said, her voice rising slightly. "My daughter used company resources, company time, to plan a scheme that could reflect poorly on this entire firm. That was a lie built on nothing, an accusation invented on the spot, and I watched her say it with the same total conviction she'd used my entire childhood to insist that everyone else was the problem, never her. "I need you to leave," I said. My voice didn't shake. I was surprised by that, afterward, how steady it came out. "This is my job, Mom. This is the one thing you haven't managed to ruin yet, and you are not taking it too." She looked at me like I'd struck her. "You have always been so ungrateful," she said, loud enough now that the lobby had gone fully quiet around us, Oscar and Danielle no longer pretending not to watch. "Everything I have ever done, I have done because I love you, because I wanted better for you than what I had, and this is how you repay 24 years. You didn't come here for me, I said. You came here because Julian rejected you and you couldn't stand it, so you decided to punish me instead, because you've always confused loving someone with owning them, and you have been doing that to every man I have ever brought home since I was 16 years old. The lobby was silent enough that I heard the elevator chime somewhere behind us. My mother's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in my adult life, I watched her search for a script and come up with nothing. No deflection ready, no rewritten version of events waiting in the wings, because there was no audience left in that room willing to hand her one. Priya, to her enormous credit, stepped forward and said quite calmly that security would need to escort her out if she didn't leave voluntarily, and something about hearing that phrase, security, spoken aloud by a stranger in a navy cardigan, seemed to finally break through whatever version of reality my mother had been operating in for the last hour. She gathered her folder, her hands unsteady now in a way that looked, for once, involuntary rather than performed, and walked toward the doors without another word. I stood in that lobby for a long moment after she left, Priya's hand briefly on my shoulder, Danielle mouthing, "Are you okay?" from across the room, and I realized I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not victory, something quieter and heavier than that. I had just watched my mother's mask come off in front of strangers, completely, and there had been nothing underneath it that surprised me. That was the part that stayed with me the rest of the day. Not the confrontation itself, but the confirmation. News of the lobby confrontation moved through my family faster than I expected, faster even than Diane's original fictional version of events had traveled 3 weeks earlier. Priya, it turned out, had a cousin who worked at the same accounting firm as my Aunt Denise, and by that Sunday, the real sequence of events, the folder, the fake HR complaint, the screenshots captioned in my mother's own handwriting, had reached almost everyone Diane had spent 3 weeks trying to convince otherwise. Aunt Denise called me that Sunday night, her voice different than it had been on the earlier call, steadier, angrier on my behalf in a way I hadn't heard from her before. "I want you to know I believe you," she said. "I always did, honestly, but I didn't want to believe your mother could go that far. I do now." She told me she'd stopped answering Diane's calls that week, and that my grandmother Ruth had done the same, a fact that landed harder than I expected, because Ruth rarely took sides in anything, having spent decades trying to keep peace in a family that made peace difficult. When I called her myself, Ruth's voice was quiet in a way that told me she'd been thinking about this for longer than 3 weeks. "I told you once there's a difference between being loved and being wanted," she said. "I should have said more when you were younger. I'm sorry I didn't. Not everyone landed where I expected." My cousin Mateo, the one who'd noticed Diane's behavior with Cody Ferris back when I was 16, texted me a single line, "I always knew," followed by an offer to help however I needed, including, if it came to it, writing a statement about what he'd witnessed over the years. My Uncle Philip, Diane's younger brother, took longer, calling me nearly 2 weeks after the lobby incident to say, carefully, that he still loved his sister but couldn't defend what she'd done, and that he thought she needed help she'd never been willing to get. That call meant more to me than I expected it to, mostly because Philip had never been the type to say difficult things directly. Diane, for her part, did not go quietly. In the 2 weeks that followed, she called my workplace twice more, both times asking for a supervisor by name, both times redirected by Priya, who'd apparently taken it upon herself to flag the calls internally so no one downstream would be caught off guard. She showed up unannounced at Julian and Theo's engagement dinner at a restaurant on East State Street, a detail I only learned about because Theo texted me a photo of her standing at the hostess stand, arguing quietly with the maitre d' about a reservation that didn't exist before she was asked to leave a second time in 1 month. She called Grant, my old boyfriend, for reasons I still don't fully understand, apparently trying to explain her version of events to him too, though he texted me afterward, almost apologetically, to say he'd told her he didn't want to be involved and hung up. The most serious escalation came in early December, when a letter arrived at Hallbrook and Weiss addressed to the head of human resources, 4 typed pages outlining allegations against me that ranged from exaggerated to invented outright, printed on the same kind of paper I recognized from the folder in the lobby. HR called me in, not accusingly, but carefully, the way people talk to you when they're trying to figure out if a complaint has teeth. I told them the truth, the whole 6 years of it if they wanted it, and by the time I finished, my supervisor Renata looked less concerned about me and more concerned for me, which was its own strange kind of relief. The letter went nowhere. Corporate flagged it as a personal dispute with no bearing on employment, closed the file within a week, and Renata told me privately that if my mother contacted the company again, they'd consider it harassment and respond accordingly. I looked into what that would actually mean, in the practical sense, because by that point I needed to know my options existed even if I never used them. A lawyer a coworker recommended told me, over a 45-minute consultation that cost $180, that if the calls and letters continued, I could pursue a civil no-contact order, though he was careful to say most families never got that far once the initial spike of conflict burned itself out. I didn't end up needing it. The letters stopped in mid-December, as suddenly as they'd started, and I've since wondered whether that was restraint or exhaustion, whether my mother finally understood there was no version of this story left for her to win, or whether she'd simply moved on to rebuilding the narrative somewhere else, with people who didn't know the ending yet. There was a night close to Christmas when the anger finally gave way to something else. I was alone in my apartment, the same one with the wine stains still faintly visible in the rug no matter how many times I'd tried to clean it. And I found myself looking at an old photo on my phone, my mother and me at a lake in Wisconsin when I was maybe 6, both of us squinting into the sun, her arm slung easily around my shoulders in a way that looked, in that frozen frame, like something uncomplicated. I sat with that photo for a long time. I let myself grieve the mother I'd needed her to be, the one who existed in glimpses sometimes, at school plays, on quiet mornings, in the years before every man I loved became something she needed for herself. That grief didn't cancel out what she'd done. It just existed alongside it, the way two true things can occupy the same evening without resolving each other. I cried harder that night than I had since the day Grant left, not because I missed the woman my mother actually was, but because I missed the one I'd spent 24 years hoping she might still become. My father, Marcus, reached out that same week, the first time in nearly a decade, having heard some secondhand version of events through Philip, who I hadn't even realized still had his number. His message was short. I heard what happened. I'm sorry I wasn't there to see it coming sooner. I didn't respond right away. When I did, weeks later, it wasn't forgiveness, exactly, more like the beginning of a door left slightly open, which felt like enough for where I was. Julian and Theo checked in on me constantly through that stretch of winter, in the specific, practical way real friends do when they know grand gestures matter less than small, consistent ones. Julian showed up on a Wednesday in January with a bottle of wine and a new rug, unceremoniously rolling up the stained one and carrying it down to his car without asking if I was ready to let it go. I think we're done needing that particular reminder in your living room, he said, and I didn't argue with him. Theo, for his part, started a running joke that never quite stopped being funny to either of us, referring to my mother only as your former mother-in-law, which should have felt too soon and somehow never did, because laughing at it took some of its power away. I started seeing a therapist that January, a woman named Carol Okafor, with an office above a dry cleaner on Alpine Road, mostly because Aunt Denise pushed me toward it more than once, and partly because I'd started noticing how much of my adult decision-making, who I trusted, who I let close, how long I waited before believing someone actually cared about me, had been quietly shaped by 24 years of watching my mother turn every relationship I had into a competition I hadn't agreed to. Enter. Carol didn't tell me to cut Diane off completely. Not at first. She asked me questions instead, patient, specific ones, about what contact with my mother had cost me over the years versus what it had given me, and let me arrive at the arithmetic myself over the course of several sessions that spring. I didn't reach a full decision about my mother until March, 4 months after the lobby. When Diane resurfaced with a phone call I almost didn't answer. Her voice was different, smaller somehow, and for the first few minutes, I let myself hope this might be the conversation where something actually shifted. She apologized, in a fashion, saying she was sorry I'd been hurt, sorry things had gotten so out of hand, sorry the family had taken sides against her. Every apology arrived wrapped around a complaint about how she'd been treated, until eventually she arrived at the real reason for the call. She needed money, she said, $1,200, for a car repair she couldn't otherwise cover, and she wondered if, given everything, I might consider helping her out, given how much she'd sacrificed for me over the years. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, listening to the particular silence of someone waiting for guilt to do its usual work. I'm not going to send you money, Mom, I said finally, and I don't think we should talk again until you're willing to actually own what happened, not just what it cost you. She was quiet and then, predictably, angry, telling me I was cold, that I'd changed, that Carol Okafor or whoever I was seeing had turned me against my own family. I let her finish. Then I told her I loved her, which was still true in the complicated, worn-down way it had always been true, and that loving her didn't mean I owed her unlimited access to my life. I hung up before she could respond. That was the last real conversation we've had. There were logistical loose ends that took longer to close than the emotional ones did. I changed the locks on my apartment that spring, not because Diane had ever shown up unannounced there the way she had at Julian's, but because the thought of her having a key, a leftover from years earlier when she'd watered my plants during a work trip, sat wrong with me once I understood what she was capable of when she felt entitled to something. I updated the emergency contact on file at Hallbrook and Weiss, replacing her name with Denise's, a small bureaucratic gesture that felt, oddly, like one of the more significant boundaries I drew that entire year. I stopped attending the extended family Thanksgiving at my grandmother's, not out of anger exactly, but because Ruth herself gently suggested it might be easier for everyone that year, and I understood what she meant without needing her to say it plainly. Diane still came. I didn't. Priya and I stayed close after that winter too, in a way I hadn't expected from a work friendship that had started as little more than shared elevators and polite small talk. She told me once, over coffee that February, that watching my mother sit in that lobby with her folder open on her knees had reminded her of her own aunt, a woman who'd spent years insisting every hardship in the family was secretly about her, and that some part of her had wanted to intervene the moment Diane walked through the doors, before I'd even arrived. I didn't know that at the time, I told her, thinking that in a place I felt so exposed and small, she hadn't wanted to make things worse. She told me she hadn't made anything worse. If anything, her steadiness that day had kept the whole thing from becoming something even uglier than it already was. Danielle and Oscar, the two co-workers who'd slowed near the elevators that afternoon, never brought it up directly, which I appreciated more than I let on, though Oscar did leave a a small potted succulent on my desk the following Monday, with a sticky note that just said, "Hang in there, no explanation needed." Small kindnesses like that added up over that winter in ways I didn't fully register until months later. Looking back, realizing how many people had quietly chosen to be gentle with me during a stretch of time when gentleness wasn't something I'd learned to expect from the people closest to me by blood. Spring turned into summer, and life did the quiet, undramatic thing life does after a rupture like that. It kept going, in smaller and steadier increments than the 6 months before it. Julian and Theo got married in June. A small ceremony at a vineyard outside Galena. 60 guests, string lights, a playlist Julian had spent 4 months perfecting. I stood up as one of Julian's groomsmen in a pale gray suit he picked out himself, and when he found me afterward at the reception, both of us a little drunk on the venue's overpriced rosé, he pulled me into a hug and said quietly, "Thank you for making me your fake boyfriend. Best decision either of us ever made." I told him I meant to thank him first, that none of it would have worked without someone willing to sit across from my mother and tell her the truth without flinching. He shrugged, in that particular Julian way. "Someone had to," he said. "Might as well have been someone with nothing to lose." I met Adrian that August at a friend's barbecue 2 towns over, a structural engineer with a slow, unhurried way of talking that I noticed immediately, mostly because it was the opposite of everything Diane had ever performed for an audience. We didn't move fast. I told him, on our 3rd date, more of the story than I'd told almost anyone outside my immediate circle, watching carefully for the flicker of discomfort I'd learned to expect from men when my mother came up, the slow retreat that had ended every relationship before Grant, and ended Grant too, eventually. Adrian didn't flinch. He just asked, evenly, what I needed from him, if anything, when it came to boundaries around her, which was such a simple, practical question that I didn't have an answer ready, because no one had ever asked it of me before. I introduced him to my mother exactly once, nearly a year after the lobby, at a cousin's baby shower where avoiding the encounter entirely wasn't possible. Diane was polite, subdued, a version of herself I hadn't seen in years, quieter, watchful, like someone who'd finally understood the room was no longer hers to command. She didn't touch his arm. She didn't ask him a single question about himself, and afterward, in the car, Adrian said only, "Your mom seems tired," which struck me as more accurate than anything else anyone had said about her in months. I didn't correct him. I wasn't sure tired was the wrong word for what 24 years of performing had finally cost her. By the following spring, I'd been promoted at Halbrook and Weiss, senior marketing coordinator, a modest raise but a real one, and I used part of it to finally replace the crooked picture frame that had hung slightly askew on my wall since the night my mother slammed my door hard enough to knock it loose. I noticed it while I was rehanging things, how long I'd left it tilted, how easily I could have fixed it any weekend in the year since, and hadn't. Some things, I've realized since, you leave crooked longer than you need to, not because you can't fix them, but because some part of you is still deciding whether you're ready to stop looking at the damage. I think about my mother more than I let on to most people. Even now, 2 years out from the lobby, 2 years out from the wine stain and the folder full of screenshots, and the sound of my own voice telling her to leave, not with the same rawness, not with the anger that used to arrive fast and hot whenever her name came up in conversation. What's left now is quieter, closer to the specific ache you feel for something that could have existed and simply didn't. A version of a mother I sometimes catch myself grieving, even though the woman she actually is remains, as far as I know, largely unchanged. Aunt Denise tells me occasionally, in the careful way people share information they're not sure you want, that Diane has a new circle of friends from a book club she joined last fall, that she talks about me sometimes, in fragments, usually favorably, usually in a version of the story where the facts have softened around the edges the way they always eventually do in her retelling. I don't ask for details. I've made peace with the fact that my mother will likely always be, on some level, the narrator of her own defense, and that expecting a different ending to that particular story is its own kind of self-harm I've decided to stop practicing. My grandmother Ruth passed that winter, quietly, in her sleep, at 81, and at the funeral I stood 2 rows away from my mother for the first time in over a year, both of us dry-eyed and careful, the whole family arranged around us like furniture nobody wanted to rearrange. Diane approached me afterward, in the parking lot, her makeup smudged in a way I'd genuinely never seen on her before, not performed grief, something closer to the real thing. She didn't apologize, not exactly, not in the full accounting I once told myself I needed from her, before I could ever fully let her back in. She just said, "I know I've made this hard for you," in a voice I hadn't heard from her since I was a child, and for a moment, I saw something underneath 24 years of performance that looked almost like a person capable of change. I don't know if she is. I've stopped waiting to find out, not out of bitterness, but because waiting had started to cost me more than the answer was worth. Denise found me by the cars afterward, wrapping an arm around my shoulders without saying anything for a long moment, the 2 of us watching Diane's car pull out of the lot alone, no one walking her to it. "She would have wanted you two to make peace," Denise said eventually, meaning Ruth, and I told her I thought that was probably true, and that I still didn't know if peace and safety could always occupy the same relationship, or whether sometimes you had to choose between them. Denise didn't answer that directly. She just squeezed my shoulder once and said that Ruth had always been proud of me anyway, whatever peace looked like in the end. Adrian and I moved in together that spring, into a small house on Harrison Avenue with a yard big enough for the garden I'd always wanted and never had room for. He proposed in October, on the same lake in Wisconsin where the photo of 6-year-old me and my mother had been taken decades earlier, though I didn't tell him that until afterward, standing there with the ring still unfamiliar on my hand, because some symmetry felt too heavy to explain in the moment itself. I said yes before he finished the sentence, which he still brings up, laughing, whenever the story comes up at dinner parties. I didn't invite my mother to the wedding. That decision took longer to reach than almost any other one I made in those 2 years. Longer than firing the locksmith who couldn't get the new locks installed on schedule. Longer than deciding whether to keep my maiden name professionally. Longer even than the decision to stop attending Thanksgiving at Ruth's old house, which Denise now hosts instead. I sat with it through most of that summer, turning it over the way you turn over a stone looking for the version underneath that doesn't cut you. What I landed on eventually was simple enough that I was almost embarrassed it had taken me so long to arrive at it. A wedding is one of the only days in a person's life built entirely around safety, around being surrounded only by people who want good things for you without needing anything back in return. I had spent 24 years watching my mother turn every good thing in my life into something that was somehow also about her. I wasn't going to let her do it to that day too. I think about the years before Grant sometimes, the boys and men whose names I still remember clearly, Cody and Tyler and Preston and Isaac, ordinary names for ordinary relationships that never got the chance to become anything more than that because my mother needed them to end before they could. I don't blame myself the way I used to, for staying quiet as long as I did, for making excuses, for calling it just her personality for the better part of a decade. I understand now that it takes most people longer than they'd like to admit to see clearly the shape of something they grew up inside of. You don't get perspective on the water until you're finally standing on the shore looking back at it. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from loving someone who was never capable of loving you the way you needed. A loneliness that doesn't disappear just because you finally stop expecting them to change. I still feel it sometimes, usually in small, unguarded moments, seeing a mother and daughter shopping together at the grocery store, laughing easily over nothing, or watching one of my coworkers take a call from her own mother during lunch, rolling her eyes with genuine affection at whatever mundane thing was being discussed on the other end. I used to think that kind of ease was something everyone eventually got, if they were patient enough, if they loved hard enough, if they gave their mother enough chances to become the person they needed her to be. I know now that isn't true. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for a version of someone that was never actually available to them, and calling that patience instead of what it really is, which is a slow, quiet kind of self-neglect. Julian gave a toast at his own wedding that ended up meaning more to me than almost anything anyone said to me that entire year, including the vows. He raised his glass toward the room and said that the truest tests of love aren't always romantic ones, that sometimes the clearest evidence of who actually loves you shows up in the people willing to sit across from someone who's hurting you and tell them the truth, even when it costs them something to say it out loud. He didn't say my name. He didn't need to. Half the room already knew the story by then, and the other half figured it out from the way I had to look down at the table for a second before I could clap. I've told this story more times now than I ever expected to. First just to Carol in her office above the dry cleaner, then to Adrian on our third date, then eventually, in pieces, to almost everyone who's come to matter to me since. Every time I tell it, I notice something different lands hardest depending on who's listening. For some people it's the folder in the lobby, the specific, calculated cruelty of a mother willing to threaten her own daughter's livelihood over a rejection that was never actually hers to suffer. For others it's the earlier years, the boyfriends whose names most people forget the moment I mention them, the slow accumulation of small betrayals that never quite crossed a line clear enough to name, until eventually the pattern became the whole shape of my adult life without my ever choosing it. For me, if I'm honest, the part that stays with me longest isn't the confrontation in the lobby, or even the wine stain spreading across my rug that night at the kitchen table. It's the 6 weeks in between, the ones where my mother genuinely believed she'd fallen in love with a man who had never, for one single second, been available to her. A man who belonged fully and happily to someone else. A man who was, from the very beginning, only ever pretending. She built an entire emotional reality around something that was never real, with the same total conviction she'd used my whole life to insist her jealousy of my happiness was actually generosity, that her intrusions were actually love, that the daughter standing in front of her, hurting, was actually the ungrateful one. That's the part I keep returning to, not because it's the most dramatic moment in the story, but because it's the clearest window I ever got into who she really was underneath everything else. A woman capable of believing almost anything, as long as believing it let her stay at the center of her own story. My mother never did learn there's a difference between being loved and being wanted, the thing my grandmother tried to warn me about years before I understood what she meant. I don't think she ever will, not fully, not at this point in her life, and I've made a kind of peace with that. The way you make peace with weather you can't control, by building your life somewhere it doesn't reach you as often. I used to believe her inability to let me be loved by anyone else came from some deep, specific hatred of me, some cruelty aimed directly at her own daughter. I don't believe that anymore. I think it came from something smaller and sadder than hatred, an emptiness she never learned how to fill any other way, so she filled it with whatever attention was closest, even when the cost was every good thing that ever ever tried to reach me. I got married in October, in a backyard on Harrison Avenue, strung with the same kind of lights Julian used at his own wedding 2 years earlier. 40 guests, no folder, no borrowed dress, no performance from anyone in the room. My mother wasn't there. I've made peace with that too, mostly, on most days. Though I won't pretend there isn't a version of that afternoon in my head where things went differently, where she stood somewhere in the crowd behaving like someone capable of loving me, without needing something back in return. That version doesn't exist. It never did. What exists instead is the one I actually got, imperfect in its own specific way, missing someone who by every right should have been standing closest to me, and full, still, of people who chose to be there without needing a single thing from me, except my happiness. I don't know if my mother will ever read this, in whatever form it eventually reaches her, whether through someone who knows us both, or through the particular strange grapevine that seems to carry everything back to her eventually, whether she wants it to or not. If she does, I don't think she'll recognize herself in it the way everyone else will. That's the truest thing I can tell you about a person like her. Even now, even after everything, I don't think she believes she ever did anything wrong at all. She believes, I suspect, that she was simply a woman who loved her daughter too much to let her go easily. A woman the world never appreciated the way it should have. She believes that the way she's always believed everything, completely, without room for another version. I know the real one now. I carry it the way you carry any true thing, quietly, without needing anyone else to confirm it, because I lived it myself, every year of it, long before I understood what to call it. My mother flirted with every boyfriend I ever brought home for 6 years, because she believed, somewhere underneath all of it, that her own daughter could never deserve real love, or happiness, or a man who actually stayed. I used to think that belief was about me, some verdict on my worth she'd handed down and expected me to accept. I understand now it was never about me at all. It was about her, and what she was never able to give herself, and what she decided, somewhere along the way, she'd rather take from me than watch me have, and she didn't. I have it now anyway. That's the part she never counted on.